What would you say matters most to you right now? Friends? Is it sports? Grades? Maybe your boyfriend or your girlfriend? Or maybe it's your faith. It may not feel like it sometimes, but the way you prioritize things in your life right now matters. So even though asking you what matters most seems like a harmless question, it's actually a big deal. Why? Because the things you prioritize now can impact your future. And I imagine this sounds like something you'd expect an adult to say. I get it. It is kind of an adultish way to start a message, but it's true. What you prioritize now can lay the groundwork for what happens after you leave high school. With that in mind, we come back to the question we've been asking throughout this series. Can faith and science coexist? Now let's add another question. What in the world does that question have to do with how we prioritize our lives? Let's talk about it. And as a high school student, it's important that you figure out how to view faith and science in a healthy co-relationship. Let me illustrate with these building blocks. Now, as you go through high school, you're stacking the building blocks of your faith. You may not even realize you're doing this, but it's true. Now, you're here at church, so I think it's safe to say that at least has some importance in your lives, or at least for your parents because they made you come. I get it. Now, you might be connected to your small group, so maybe that's something that you would build a bit of a foundation on. And maybe you read your Bible and you pray a little more consistently than you have before. So I could say that is something you would also build. Now, even if you're not sure about all this church and Jesus stuff, you showed up today, so you're at least considering whether or not faith should be an important part of your life. No matter where you are in your faith, you're stacking blocks, hopefully to build a strong faith of your own that will stay strong throughout your life. As you build your personal blocks, I want to talk about one layer in particular, and it's these bottom ones right here. As you build your faith with important blocks like small groups and prayer and attending church and serving others, there's a layer of these blocks that matters more than all the rest. It's the foundation. Let me ask you this. What foundation are you building your faith on? What holds up your faith? What makes it matter to you? I think for a lot of us, it's two things. First, Bible stories. Here's what I mean by that. Our faith matters because the Bible tells us it should. We believe in Jesus because we trust what the Bible says about him. Maybe we're inspired by stories like David and Goliath or Noah and his ark. Maybe we've heard these stories for as long as we can remember, and so we just assume we should believe them. And the second thing is family traditions. Now, for others of us, if we're really honest, we'd admit we're here just because it's what our family does. You may still be debating what you believe, but you know it's important to your mom or your stepdad that you show up. So you show up for them. You've built your faith on the fact that your family said it was important. And it's not worth creating conflict by abandoning your faith when you still live under their roof. So for a lot of you, you go through high school with a faith either built on the stories in the Bible or the traditions passed down in your family. And for a lot of you, that worked for a long time. But here's the problem. What happens when science challenges them? What happens when science bumps up against the stories we read in the Bible or the faith that's been passed down to us from our family? If the bottom blocks of your faith are stories in the Bible or the fact that your whole family believes, what happens when a classmate or a college professor or a future boss challenges what you believe? If someone brings solid evidence to suggest that the stories you believe are false or the traditional beliefs of your family are outdated, will you hit a crisis in your faith? I think this is why 50 to 80% of students walk away from faith after high school, because their bottom row of blocks wasn't strong enough to handle what life threw at them. And if someone can disprove your foundation, all the faith you've built can come crashing down. But here's the good news. It doesn't have to be this way. Science isn't the enemy. Even though it sometimes asks questions our faith doesn't have answers for, that's okay. We can build our faith on a foundation that will stand up to any argument or evidence that science presents. Even better, we can take what science says and not see it as going against the building blocks of our faith. We can build our faith on a bottom block that has stood the test for 2,000 years and was actually intended to be the foundation of every Christian's faith from the beginning. So what should the bottom block be? It's something that cannot be explained, but many people experience firsthand. Let me explain. A little over 2,000 years ago, the man who would become the center of Christianity, Jesus, was crucified on a Roman cross. He was brutally killed because he claimed to be God in human form. He didn't deserve this death. He had never mistreated or wronged anybody. Instead, he chose to die in order to demonstrate how big God's love was, is, and will continue to be. He showed us what a good and gracious God looks like. Jesus' death was a way to fix what was broken between us and God. So he died on the cross and then was placed in a tomb. Even though it was a surprise that religious leaders were willing to kill him to shut him up, his death itself wasn't a surprise. Every religious and political leader died eventually. But Jesus' story was different, which is what makes Christianity different. According to one of Jesus' closest friends, Matthew, some women were heading to Jesus' tomb, most likely to give him a proper burial after the crucifixion. Then Matthew tells us what happens next. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay." Maybe you've gotten used to this story because you've heard it so much growing up. But try to imagine what it must have felt like for the women who were at the tomb. They had an angel show up and tell them that what happened with every other dead person wasn't true with Jesus. He didn't stay dead. He resurrected. You don't have to be a scientific genius to know that things like this aren't supposed to happen, but it did. And since this event 2,000 years ago, the Christian faith has been built on the foundation of the resurrection. That's the most important building block. One of the most famous Christians of all time, Paul, said this in a letter to the church in Corinth. "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." In other words, without the resurrection, everything we believe is pointless. Going from dead to alive is what gives us the point of what and why we believe. Paul didn't say, if the earth wasn't made in 6 days, our preaching is useless and so is your faith. And he didn't say, if Jonah wasn't swallowed by an actual fish, or if Noah wasn't on an actual ark, and if Adam and Eve didn't have a conversation with an actual snake, our faith is useless. He didn't say that because those aren't the building blocks of our faith. Because whether science says the earth was made in 6 days or 6 billion years ago, it doesn't really affect our faith at all, because that isn't the point. What happened on a cross and the days following, that's what matters. As you continue to prioritize the foundation for the rest of your life, here's what I want you to do. Build your faith on what matters most. As you prioritize what matters most when it comes to your faith and your future, focus on the main thing. The bottom blocks of your faith should be an event, the resurrection. Now here's what's cool about this. Hundreds of people testified to seeing Jesus after he was brought back to life. There are multiple accounts of people who wrote about what they saw later. Jesus' closest friends and even his brother James were tortured, and many of them were killed because they refused to deny that they saw the risen Jesus. It doesn't make sense, and science can't explain it. But the first Christians saw it, they heard about it, then changed their lives and the culture they lived in as a result. We join a long line of people who placed their faith in Jesus because of the resurrection. So I ask again, what is the foundation of your faith? I want to challenge you to do 2 things with everything we've talked about today. First, don't walk away from faith unnecessarily. Maybe you've been wrestling with what we've been talking about. Maybe there was a Bible story or a family belief that doesn't quite add up for you. Maybe you've learned something in science class that's really tough to argue with, and you think it has the potential to topple everything you believe. But if you build your faith on the resurrection, that doesn't have to be the case. You can ask questions, wrestle with scientific evidence, and still keep your faith in place. Second, build your faith on what matters most. Your faith in Jesus is based on something that he did 2,000 years ago, with the evidence of hundreds of witnesses and friends who died defending what they saw. When you head into your future, your faith can stand on that foundation, no matter what challenges science or anyone else presents. When you build your faith on what matters most, you will build a faith that lasts. Science can't explain the person of Jesus. They can't explain the life he lived. They can't explain the resurrection he pulled off. But that's what matters most. The questions or doubts or uncertainty you feel are safe here. If you still aren't sure how science and faith go together, you're in the right place to have important conversations like this one. God can handle your doubts and the skepticism that science can sometimes raise. All I would ask is that you would give us a chance to talk with you about it. Maybe you're on the fence when it comes to faith. You're not sure you believe all of this, maybe even because of something you've learned in science class or in an article or from a family member. And if that's the case, relax, it's okay. Please ask for help. Give us the chance to have a calm conversation with you about the foundations of your faith. And as we close this series, I want you to know this. Science and faith don't have to be worlds apart. Science gives us the opportunity to learn more about the God who is behind all of creation. And you and I can have faith in God and explore science because we trust in Jesus, who created the world and changed the world through his resurrection. As you head to group today, let me ask you once again, what is the current foundation of your faith?